Let it be with me according to your word. We've sung that line several times this morning. And if you've been here for worship on other Sundays during Advent, you've sung it several more times on those days as well. That song by our own Andrew Donaldson, and that line in particular, has been a refrain for us this Advent, present every week. It may also now be a song that has burrowed its way deep into your subconscious, and maybe one you have found yourself singing at all hours of the day or night. No apologies for that. I think it's a pretty good song to have stuck in your head. Let it be with me according to your word. Those words are Mary's, of course. It's how she concludes the encounter with the angel Gabriel in that passage that is so familiar and yet always so strange at the same time. Like a hazy winter morning when the mountains aren't quite in view, even though you know they're there. We don't really get many details about what the scene looked like, whether Mary was in her bedroom or her kitchen or her backyard. We don't get any details about what the visitor looked like, whether there was blinding light or a flash of wings, or nothing very remarkable about this visitor at all. We just hear that Mary, a girl, probably 13 years old or so, in a tiny town in an outlying, forgotten part of the Roman Empire, found herself face to face with a messenger from God. We can forget what a strange story this is, can't we? The angel tells her there is a child in store, and he tells her something of what that child's life will be all about. Son of the Most High, heir to David's throne and everlasting kingdom. Mary listens patiently and then asks that famous question, literally, how can this be since I do not know a man? Yes, that part of the equation is baffling, but really so is everything else that the angel has just told her. Mary just as well could have asked a different question. How can this be, since I am not wealthy? How can this be, since I am not famous? Or how can this be, since I am not a queen? Mary could have just as well asked any of those other questions, because the angel is speaking to a young, poor woman in a culture that valued age and wealth and masculinity. Nothing about Gabriel's word really makes any sense. So Mary asks about the biology of the whole thing, and Gabriel doesn't really have anything to say about that. He simply assures her that everything will work out. Trust me, he says, the Spirit will take care of everything. I mean, look, your cousin Elizabeth has already got a child on the way. And you think that's something? Wait until you see what's in store for the world through this child. Nothing will be impossible with God. So that's the end of Gabriel's speech. There's no question that comes afterward. No, so how does that sound, Mary? Or, so are you in? So does Mary have a choice in the matter? People have disagreed about that for ages. So I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself. But I'll tell you that I think she did have a choice. We don't get stage directions in Luke's gospel. We don't get a description of the look on Gabriel's face or of how long this whole encounter lasted. But the way I picture it, Gabriel finishes his speech and has to wait a little bit. I imagine a long, pregnant pause, sorry, pun intended, and the angel up on tiptoes, a great silence all around, while the whole creation held its breath as Mary let all of this sink in a little bit. I imagine Gabriel starting to worry, maybe wringing his hands, getting ready to blurt something out. Come on, say something, Mary. When Mary finally took a deep breath looked him in the eye, and said it. Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. What the angel really had to offer Mary was a promise. A promise that through a child, God intended to do something new in the world. The angel came with a promise and with the implied question, will you be part of it, Mary? Mary's response was simply her way of saying, yes. Gabriel came with a promise from God, and in that sense, he's not doing anything particularly new. Making promises is simply what God does. Many theologians would argue that this is one of the central characteristics, if not the characteristic, of God in the Bible. The God of the Bible is a God who makes promises. It's how the story of Noah and the flood ends, with a promise of compassion. It's how the story of Abraham and Sarah ends, with a promise of blessing. It's how the story of the people's deliverance from Egypt ends, with a promise of everlasting relationship. And so it's where Jesus' story begins, with a promise of a child and of new life in him. So there you have it. Our God is a God who makes promises. And in a very real sense, our job is to believe them. So I realize I'm using pretty dangerous language there, because we tend to think of belief in a purely intellectual sense. Like, do you believe in 6-day creation? Or do you believe in evolution? Or do you believe in the virgin birth? The church often hasn't helped matters at all on this. It's often joined right in and made Christian faith about agreeing to a checklist of ideas. Our time tends to frame belief in those sorts of passive intellectual terms to make it all about facts and figures, when really, to believe a promise is much more about trusting the one who made it. If you're going to believe a promise, it means you trust that the one making it will follow through. It means you expect something to change. It means you are willing to change your life and make room for it to happen. A teacher of mine talks about promises this way. When he promises his children they'll play a game when he gets home from work, he says, the game is laid out on the kitchen table by the time he gets home. When someone promises to give you a ride home from church, you don't make other plans to get home. When someone promises to make you dinner, you don't eat somewhere else. When someone promises to meet you for coffee, you get on the bus and you get off at the right stop and you take a seat at the table. Pastor Wes Avram speaks about faith in this way. We make a home in the world for the hope we find in the one promised. Let me say that again. We make a home in the world for the hope we find in the one promised. That's what it means to believe a promise. It doesn't involve your brain alone. It involves your heart and your hands and your spirit, to make a home for the promise in our lives and in the world. That's what it means to believe. Mary got it. When she ran off to see Elizabeth, both the old cousin and the child could tell that she did. As soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leaped for joy, Elizabeth said. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord. Mary got it. The song she sang for Elizabeth and for the whole church after shows that she did. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly, she sang. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Of course, Caesar was still on his throne. and the peasants in Mary's village still lived in poverty. Of course, Caesar still had banquet halls stuffed to bursting with food and drink, and the peasants in Mary's village endured the insecurity of subsistence farming. Of course, everything Mary sang about had not come true, but she sang as if it already had. Because Mary got it. She was making a home for the promise that was already beginning to come true in Jesus, in her heart, in her voice, even in her body. She heard God's promise and began living as if it were true. So that's our task too. To live as though the promises we hear this season are coming true, even when appearances might tell us otherwise. Not just to think about it, but to make a home for it in your life. Not just to think about God beating swords into plowshares, but to live as if it's true even now. Not just to think about God lifting up the lowly and filling the hungry with good things, but to participate in that work God is already doing. Not just to think about God reconciling the world in the child born in Bethlehem, but to treat the people in your own life as if it really is true. That's the challenge and the gift in this season of the promise of Christ's coming again and again. Let it be with me according to your word. It's Mary's yes. So let it be our yes this season as well. Because we wait with certainty in Advent. We wait for Christ, in whom every one of God's promises is yes. Amen.